Today's going to be 32-3. We're going to take a look at coordinate trigonometry with a tangent and the reciprocal functions. So using the coordinate system, we're going to find those trig ratios. Now, just as a reminder, if I have a value of rotation, so let's just say I take some radius and I rotate it theta, that radius is going to end up at some point x, y, and I could create trig ratios from that. So I could say the sine of theta, we said that it was y over r, the cosine theta is x over r, the tangent of theta was y over x, and the corresponding reciprocals. And then the radius we said was just the distance between the 2 points, so the square root of x squared plus y squared. And then from there we had to decide, okay, if we knew that that's how they're all related, how do I then draw my triangle, right? Because for here we're going to have to plot a triangle. I have to figure out what quadrant is my triangle going to be in. And so for here we said that, well, we need to relate our sine and cosine to our x's and y's and stuff like that, right? So sine was y, cosine was x, and depending on if x's were positive or my y's were positive or negative, we were able to determine the quadrant. Well, this is cosecant now. So it might help us to either just think of cosecant as relating to y directly, or we can say that, well, cosecant does relate to sine, and we know that sine relates to y. Well, it says less than 0, so my y is going to be negative. My cotangent, we know that that's going to be, that relates to tangent. Tangent is y over x, or sine over cosine. That has to be negative. Now, if tangent's negative, either this top portion is negative or the bottom portion is negative. Well, we already know that my y has to be negative, and so then that kind of satisfies the condition there. And so what quadrant has a positive x and a negative y? That's going to be quadrant 4. My secant has to be positive and my tangent has to be negative. Well, secant relates to x, and we know that that has to be positive. Tangent, we said, is y over x. That has to be negative. Well, I know for a fact that my x has to be positive, so therefore my y then has to be negative. So that satisfies both conditions there. And so where do I have a negative y and a positive x? That's going to be quadrant 4 again. And then for my cotangent, has to be negative. So if my cotangent's negative, we know that that is x over y. One of them is negative. I don't know which one yet. So moving over to cosecant, cosecant relates to y. Y has to be positive. So I have to say that's positive, which forces that to be negative to satisfy the condition. And so it's going to be quadrant number 2. That's going to have the negative x and the positive y. So the next part says, from the following information, find the exact values of the requested trig values. So it gives us a ratio. It gives us a little bit more information about how my ratio interacts with the quadrant, with the coordinate system. And it's going to ask us specifically to find, in this case, secant theta. So I need to figure which quadrant I'm going to put this in. So I know that it says that my sine is positive, so I know that my y is positive. It says my secant is negative, so I know that my x is negative, and so I know that that's going to be in quadrant number 2. Now, this being my reference angle, labeling things, I have opposite over hypotenuse. Well, for me to find secant theta, I know that secant theta is going to be, well, cosine, let's relate it to that. It is x over r. So this is going to be r over x. So my radius is 17. I don't know what my x value is. So I'm going to have to use the Pythagorean theorem. So if I did 15 squared plus x squared equals 17 squared, I would have found that x equals 8. But I know that my x is negative because it's moving in a negative direction, so I had to label it negative 8. So then to find my secant ratio, we said that that's the radius over x. So to find my secant ratio, we said that it's going to be the radius over x. So secant of theta is going to be my radius, 17, over my x. So the first thing that I did here is I had to figure out which quadrant was in, and that was going to be quadrant number 2. And I was able to determine that because I said that my sine or my y value has to be positive, my secant value or my x value has to be negative. That's the quadrant that has a negative x value and a positive y value. So I drew the triangle in the quadrant, and with the given ratio, my sine, we know that that's opposite over hypotenuse. I now have to find the missing ratio, which happens to be secant. Well, I needed this x value to find that, and so I used the Pythagorean theorem to be able to find that missing value. And then I was able to say that my ratio, step 3, is going to be negative 17 over 8. Next example. So same thing here. So it says from the following information, find the exact values of the requested trig ratio or the trig value. So the first thing I need to do, I need to figure out what quadrant my reference angle is going to lie in. Well, it says my cosine theta equals 2 root 2 over 3. So this is going to be a positive for my x value. My cosecant is less than 0, so my y value for cosecant, that's going to be negative. So drawing it in my quadrant, which is going to be step 2, I know that it's going to be here in quadrant number 4. And so for cosine, we know it's adjacent over hypotenuse. So adjacent over hypotenuse, that's why it's 2 root 2 over 3. Now once again, to find my y value here, because I know that cotangent is going to be x over y, well, I need to know what my y value is. So to do that, I need to use the Pythagorean theorem. A squared plus b squared equals c squared. And so doing that, you're going to find that y gives you 1, but it's moving down. Well, on the axis, moving down is in the negative direction, so that's why I said negative 1. So then for my cotangent theta, we said that it's going to be x over y, so my x value over my y value. Or another way of just saying that is negative 2 root 2. Let's look at one more. So the first thing I need to do is I need to figure what quadrant the reference angle is going to be in. Well, I know that my sine value is positive, so my y value is going to be positive. My tangent, it's y over x, has to be negative. Well, if my y value has to be positive, my x has to be negative. So I know that that's going to be quadrant number 2. So now drawing the triangle in the quadrant. Quadrant number 2, now remember, all my triangles have to be perpendicular to the x-axis. Labeling this opposite over hypotenuse. I need to find that value there. Now, one thing that's, if we pay attention to, it does say cosecant. Well, I already have all the information to find cosecant, but let's just go ahead and find the missing x value anyways. So a squared plus b squared equals c squared. A squared plus 1 equals 4 minus 1. A squared equals 3. So if I take the square root of that, that's going to give me root 3, but it's going in the negative direction. Now cosecant we said is r over y. So my radius, which is 2, over y, which is 1, and so that's what the cosecant theta is going to be, or just 2. So in closing of today's lesson, what did we learn today? Well, we examined trig ratios with tangent and its reciprocals, and so I want to hear from you. What do I do with the reciprocal functions? And the triangle is always perpendicular to what axis? This does conclude our lesson. If you have any other questions, please leave them in the comments.